right, we are live. Thank you everybody for joining us for another episode of Positively Connected in Dogs. Today I'm joined again, hopefully her face looks familiar, Amber Quann from Summit Dog Training. Amber, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today we are going to be talking about something that probably is going to ruffle some feathers. Some people tend to have big emotions about this one way or the other, and that is off-leash dogs, how we deal with them, how we train for off-leash behavior, and when to know when it's okay and safe to do it. So let's first start off with a little bit of the safety behind it, because you can't just let your dog off leash anywhere. How do you instruct your clients, Amber? Because I know you do a lot of adventure dog work with your dogs off leash. How do you start looking for those areas that are legal and safe to let dogs off leash?
Yeah, in my area, we do have leash laws throughout our entire county. And so that means that, most of our city parks and public in-town trails are not legal off-leash areas, and really not where we should be going with our off-leash dogs. However, we do fortunately have access to some lovely, more accessible off-leash areas within like a 45-minute drive. And so one of my first things that I'm going to be kind of coaching people who want to do this more with their dogs is on how to find those spots. And the nice thing about those spots, at least where I live, is when you get a little bit further out of town, it also gets safer when we're thinking about hazards like cars or, encountering people or other hazards on the trail. We still also have to consider the dangers of wildlife as well, which we might get into a little bit more deeply in a bit, I'm sure. But so I will first start by just kind of letting people kind of think through themselves. I can't tell people what to do or what not to do with their dogs, but I will share my experiences of, working with people who've been ticketed by the city for having off-leash dogs. I also partner with our local natural areas department to provide public education. And so from the working with the rangers, for those, I get to hear about the ecological aspects of the damage that off-leash dogs do in our lovely city natural areas. And so trying to kind of present it as like not just this is the thing you have to do because it's the law, but authority of the resource is what the rangers call it when talking to people about how the choices that we make can negatively impact the environment, and that needs to be one of the ultimate authorities on why we decide to be mindful about where we take our dogs off leash.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people too have that mindset of, my dog's friendly, he's social, I love dogs, so everybody loves dogs. And so when we're looking at those areas where we do have leash laws, it's for safety for you and your dog and everybody else around you. Even if your dog is social, lots of dogs do not like being bombarded by an off-leash dog. And even if your dog is social and friendly, some people don't like dogs, don't want to be jumped on. They could be hurt or knocked down. And so I think it's really important, that we are following those rules, because the more we do, the more we're going to have that ability to continue taking our dogs places.
Yes.
If we are massively breaking these rules and ordinances start getting irritated with people, they're going to start changing those rules, and we're going to lose the ability to do that. So, I think it's really important to look at both sides of that and say, hey, there are rules here, for a reason, and it's to protect the environment, to protect the people, to protect your dog and you.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting that you bring up that, natural resource component to it, because oftentimes we think, well, going into the woods is a great place to go with our dogs, away from the city, away from, the hustle and bustle and the cars. But then we do have to worry about wildlife a little bit, and make sure that we're not damaging areas where they're trying to do restoration or where there are species that are endangered. So I know that around you, since you work with your local rangers, what are some things that they have kind of brought up, as a result of off-leash dogs?
So we have a lovely river that runs through our town, and a lot of the natural areas that are overseen by the Natural Areas Department are bordering that river, which is a kind of a popular spot for people to take their dogs to play fetch, play in the water. And so there's a lot of kind of riverbank decay and deterioration,
Mhm.
erosion, where in popular spots where people are chucking sticks in the water and dogs are running up and down the banks repetitively, off leash, that really kind of can destroy that wild or preserved area.
Mhm.
Additionally, areas where dogs are, allowed to wander far from the trail might disturb wildlife travel patterns. So, like a herd of deer
Mhm.
that lives in an area that might bed down in a certain area and then travel and go and eat in another area or go to the river will be disturbed by that off leash dog,
Yep.
encountering them, or even just going well off trail and you know eliminating in that area, and the owner says, oh, it's in the woods, I don't need to pick it up. But those things happen on a scale of everybody does that with their dogs, and suddenly we have a big disruption to the natural habitat of that wildlife, which can cause ripple effects down the ecosystem. And so things like that are part of that authority of the resource that the natural area rangers have kind of been sharing their education with me on, that I try to then take and impart to my clients.
Yeah. So when you're looking at places where it is safe to let our dogs off leash, of course,
Hmm.
we're looking at any local rules or regulations.
Yep.
Oftentimes parks will have signs,
Hmm.
where they will show you a little picture of a person
Yep.
and a dog, and dogs on leash,
Yep.
and they'll say 6-foot leash laws, dogs have to
Hmm.
remain on leash. So
Yep.
when you're looking for places where you can let your dog off leash, what kind of
Yep.
features are you looking for?
Yeah, I'm looking for the lack of specific regulations. Often it will say something along the effects of dogs must be under voice control,
Hmm.
which from discussing with the rangers, like what they specifically mean by that is not, the dog has to be under your voice control, not under electronic collar control. That's not something that your dog needs to be able to respond to you in some way, shape,
Hmm.
or form. Whether you use a training tool to achieve that or not, but like your dog listening to you has to be the qualifying factors there, which takes training and investment and relationship, as we all know.
Yeah.
And then I'm also looking for the number of traffic that the trail might have, or the particular time of day I'm going. Because for me, being off leash with my dog not only means being within the law, but also means being within what's respectful for other guests.
Hmm.
And so wanting to go above and beyond to keep off leash areas legal, off leash areas, by demonstrating that my dog and I are going to be considerate of every single person on the trail. And for me, that means wanting to have some space and be able to relax a little bit and not be constantly putting my dog back on leash or constantly stepping off the path. And
Right.
so I also do tend to choose trails that are less busy or go at less busy times of the day, so that I can, be better able to relax with my dog, which I know not everyone is able to do.
Yeah.
I'm also looking for, absence of roads nearby, something where we can hike and hike away from the road versus a trail that's going to be running parallel with the road.
Hmm.
And I also really, especially when I'm first training an off leash dog or a dog to be off leash, I also really like trails with good visibility. So
Yes.
trails that I'm not going to constantly be coming through little nooks and crannies and be surprised by, wildlife or other guests on the trail, but rather I can hear and see easily what might be coming, 100 feet down the trail, so that I can plan and train accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that visibility component is huge because then you can see if something's approaching you or you might need to get your dog
Hmm.
closer to you or put them back on leash.
Yeah.
And if they do wander a little bit further, you can still see them, without
Right.
panicking and not having that visibility.
Right.
So obviously we're going to get into kind of the training of getting
Hmm.
dogs off leash because it's quite an ordeal.
Yep.
And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of
Yeah.
time, a lot of consistent training, and a
Hmm.
lot of clear training,
Yep.
training that isn't just repetition, but training
Hmm.
that is developing behaviors and making them
Yep.
stronger. But
Yep.
even with all of that, the perfect raising environment, all of the right kind of training, there are
Yep.
still some dogs that off leash adventures might not be suitable. And it doesn't mean
Hmm.
they have to not go on adventures. It just means
Right.
we use long lines and other tools
Hmm.
to help give them more freedom. So talk to us a little bit about maybe some temperament traits or personalities that maybe would lead us to the conclusion that off-leash adventures might not be suitable.
Sure. So every dog is an individual. And we have to kind of remember that when we start to make generalizations about different breeds of dogs being more or less suited, because there are exceptions to every rule.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to remember that. But traits that I look for that make a really great off-leash dog are kind of a desire to stick close to you. And that can be built, but it also can be, a genetic predisposition that makes our job easier. So a dog that's ready and willing to check in with you often, who thinks that you are pretty great to have around. Those, to kind of generalize breed traits might be, we might associate those traits with our herding breeds, who, are very codependent in a lot of ways because they have been, bred for many years to work alongside humans for their job as an objective. So then we have different types of breed traits that I might say, like, this dog can be trained to be off leash, but it's going to take a lot of intentional work on that. Might be more of our like kind of independent breed traits, like our guardian breeds, who are kind of trained to be solo in the fields, or genetics have conditioned them to really excel at that type of work. And so while they can be
Mhm.
phenomenal off-leash dogs, it's going to take a lot more intentionality on the
Yeah.
part of the human. I think similar, and you can probably speak to this as well. I've had that similar experience with our Nordic breeds who
Mhm.
are just designed to run, and go, and probably have a little bit more of that independence kind of genetically conditioned in, because that's, kind of the environment in which they've been utilized the most. And, in my experience working with Husky or other Nordic breeds with my clients, we've worked hard, had to work hard on building that stick close to us and
Yeah.
stay in the vicinity. And it is certainly possible, but it is not a given that that's going to be
Mhm.
an easy behavior for those type of dogs. So I don't know if you want to jump in and give any extra context on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Obviously, sharing my life with Malamutes has made lots of things interesting, and I love what you said about we can't make gross generalizations because there's always an exception to every rule,
Yeah.
and obviously there are certain breed traits that will make those features or those desired traits of having that off-leash ability easier. So
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that Malamutes or other Nordic breeds cannot be let off-leash, but it probably means that unless your dog is that big exception, you're probably going to have to spend a lot more time training than somebody with
Mhm.
an Aussie or a Golden,
Right.
where those dogs are a little bit more connected
Hmm.
and do tend to stick a bit closer. So
Yeah.
it's not out of the question, but it does take a lot of work. And I think the
Yeah.
other thing that's important in that training component is, amount of time we spend training and what their previous experiences have
Hmm.
been.
Yes.
Because obviously, if we're working with a dog that is a baby right off the bat, we
Yeah.
can start with puppies on teaching
Yeah.
all of these things. If we've adopted an older dog that maybe has had history of running away or history of
Hmm.
not having that positive connection built, then it could be a little bit harder
Right.
to work with.
And building off of that, I think, and this is getting into our training discussion a little bit perhaps, but I often get clients calling me after their dogs are, 10 or 11 months old, and they kind of outgrew the puppy sticky close phase of development and moved right into adolescence, when they are feeling a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more outgoing, a little bit more like, let's go out and make friends with everyone. And so clients continue to do what they've always done and go hiking with their puppy off leash, and their puppy starts practicing all of these unwanted behaviors of taking off after deer and running up to other people and running after the dog that just passed.
Oh, did we lose you? Might have lost you. Hmm. Oh, there we go. You're back.
Okay. I
So
don't know.
practicing inappropriate behaviors and running
Yes.
after deer.
Right. And then they come and now we want to rebuild their recall
Yep.
skills. But they already have this learning history. And it's certainly possible to kind of come back and tweak and correct that
Yeah.
and get them back on that more appropriate path. But it's a lot easier to not have to go down that road completely. And that's where our management comes into play of our long lines. Our kind of understanding where our puppies are at developmentally can also be important.
Mm-hmm.
With my little guy, Jamie, who I'm raising right now, he was wonderful, off leash, all good behaviors. And then one day, about like, I think 11 months old, he saw a dog friend a football field away from us and took off and went and had the best time,
Yeah.
despite me running after him and calling back. And he
Yeah.
did that once. And since then, he's been on a long line. He's been
Yeah.
much better managed. I kind of had let my guard down a little bit because he had been doing so well. And he told me that day that he was feeling more adventurous and crazy. And I don't want that practiced ever
Right.
again if I can help it. And so it's been like 3 or 4 months since that happened. And we've been revisiting some of our training. We've been managing a lot better in those environments and kind of rebuilding that so that that learning history doesn't become the normal.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's key. I think in general with management, we tend to loosen up quicker than
Mhm.
we should,
Yeah.
because we're like, things are going great.
Right.
And I don't remember the last time we were naughty. Right. But
Right.
the reason we haven't been naughty is because we've had some form of management in place,
Right.
kind of protecting us. And so it's easy for us to kind of loosen our, management as
Yep.
we think that they might be doing better. And for something like that, your example with Jamie, he had the best time.
Yeah,
So not
he
only
did.
did he practice an undesired behavior, but it got reinforced.
Right.
And that's really important then to go, okay, I got to make sure that doesn't happen again because that was a huge reinforcer.
Right.
And he just learned how fun that was. And so
Right.
going back to preventing that from happening,
Mhm.
still allowing that freedom with that long line, but then reworking, like you said, those training
Yep.
foundations to make sure that we're ingraining in that brain again,
Right.
connection, attention, recall, and all of those important pieces.
Right. And kind of wrapping up that kind of mistake scenario with Jamie, one of the things that I did in that moment as a recovery was when I finally caught up with him, it was not a like, let's keep playing with this dog, even though the
Right.
other dog was a puppy and the owners of the other dog were like, oh my gosh, this is the best day ever. Can he stay? And I was like, no, he can't stay.
Yeah.
And instead of it being like, oh, I just got to play for 30 minutes, it was like, nope, you got to play for 30 seconds and now we're back and we're on leash and we're going to go back to focusing.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake I often see is like, well, they're there now, so let's just let it happen. And yes,
Yeah.
reinforcement absolutely did still happen. He got to do a lovely little introducing himself to a new friend. But
Yeah.
like minimizing that reinforcement at that point was my recovery goal for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good. Now, something else that I think is important to talk about too, as we're talking about off-leash behavior, is of course our dogs that might be struggling with some behavior concerns, maybe some reactivity or
Mhm.
aggression. I find that oftentimes, especially in the city, those dogs don't get a ton of relaxing excursions. And so
Yep.
often people are looking to go out into nature a little bit more
Yep.
to get the dog away from those triggers and let them
Mhm.
decompress and kind of have some enjoyment.
Yep.
But as tempting as it can be, those dogs for me fall into a category where we use long lines.
Right.
How do you kind of handle that conversation when you're talking to clients?
Yeah, so I will similarly where I will teach good long line handling skills, talk about how we can help them be successful in their objectives of getting their dogs as off leash esque of an adventure as possible, but also
Yeah.
being safe and mindful. I will also, if the client is like really determined, like they're going to be off leash and it's just not a completely safe scenario, I will definitely condition a muzzle and teach the dog
Mhm.
to wear that while being off leash. And I will also kind of give my client some of my secret spots that I go to
Yeah.
where there perhaps some unmarked trails where you can tell and say with pretty much 99% certainty that if there's no cars in the parking lot at those, pull off secret trails that no one knows about, you're going to be okay for not encountering a ton of people, at least on the way out. If you turn
Yes.
around and come back, that might be the time to put your dog on a leash, because it is difficult, and certainly a vicious cycle of dogs not having a chance to decompress can definitely inform their behaviors in a negative way, and that we need to find that balance there somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So now let's kind of jump into how we build these foundations and the
Mhm.
process of it, because there's a lot of skills that our dogs need to have
Yep.
in order for them to be safe off leash.
Mhm.
And these are skills that take a lot of time to develop.
Yes.
We're working on, all three of those D's: distance, distraction, duration,
Yep.
and they have to be really solid, because you never know what
Mhm.
kind of things you're going to find out in the
Right.
environment. And normally when you're out there, we're talking about, if they don't respond to something, not only
Mhm.
is there the potential of the unwanted behavior getting reinforced,
Mhm.
because there's tons of cool stuff out in
Yep.
nature, right? Chasing
Yes.
deer is loads of fun.
Yep.
Sniffing is super
Mhm.
enriching, right?
Yep.
So not only could those unwanted behaviors get reinforced, but we also have the potential for something dangerous to happen.
Mhm.
In
Yeah.
different parts of the world, there are different wildlife out there that could hurt your dog.
Mhm.
If we're getting close to city trails, we certainly have the potential of there being
Mhm.
cars. So they have to be really, really solid. So
Mhm.
let's talk about some of the skills that you focus on when you
Yeah.
are starting your off-leash training.
Yeah. So I start with some human skills, actually, first, because we can help our dogs be successful a lot better if we're equipped with some skills. So, my top human skills are being engaged in the environment and
Mhm.
rewarding ourselves, or kind of praising ourselves when we notice things in the environment. Because, of course, our dogs are very aware of what's happening. They probably
Yeah.
know more often than we do when there's wildlife, or when there's a hiker or other dog coming down the trail. But I want us to be at least not that far behind. And
Mhm.
so, starting with just like encouraging us when we see or hear something coming down the trail to say, good job, like
Yeah.
reinforcing ourselves, like with just a little bit of, yay, call your dog back to you, praise yourself, praise your dog for being aware.
Yeah.
And then ditching the headphones, not
Yeah.
being present with our dogs. Then long line handling skills are a really important human foundation skill as well. And
Yeah.
my objective when handling my long line is, for the most part, to use it like we don't need it. In
Mhm.
that case, is I'm looking for it to be slack, at a safe level, so not
Mhm.
like pooling on the ground, but also not taut and tight all the time. And there's some
Right.
great, kind of long line handling skills videos online. So I won't necessarily get into that too much in the weeds today, but just having an idea of how do we manage and maneuver our long line so that it is
Yeah.
not what is cueing our dog to come back to us. We're going to use it to prevent mistakes and prevent things from being reinforced unwantedly.
Yeah.
But if we call our dog and they don't come, really want to resist kind of doing a tug, tug, tug on that long line, because
Yeah.
that turns into a cue super fast. And if we're trying to create skills that are resilient to when we are either having the dog drag the long line, or dropping it, or taking it off completely, we really want to make sure that we're not, as the human component of the team, adding in cues that then when they're not there, we're going to be having a hard time communicating with our dogs.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think that working on the human mechanics component is something that is often missed. And
Hmm.
especially for something like a long line, like
Yeah.
when you watch someone who has used a long line before, it looks really smooth.
Right.
But when you go to try to do that for the first time, you're like, what is happening? There's
Right.
so much here. Like, it gets tangled, you
Right.
trip on it, the dog trips on it. And
Hmm.
so it really does kind of take some skills. And I love to have people practice that without the dog,
Yes.
because you can work on really making sure that wrapping that leash up, letting line out, all of
Hmm.
that can really become muscle memory for you
Yeah.
if you practice it. And that's really
Yeah.
important, because the second you get a real dog at the end of that line, you have
Yeah.
something else to focus on. So
Right.
you need your leash handling skills to almost be like that, to be muscle memory, so that you're not
Yeah.
having to think about it,
Yeah.
when they're on the other end of that line. You're then worried
Yeah.
about training and keeping an eye on
Right.
the environment. So I love
Yes.
I love that, starting off with the human mechanics component of that.
Right. And our goal is that, for the most part, the line is there as a backup. and it's
Mm-hmm.
not there that's keeping the dog even close to you. And I often tell people, like, if their dog has really, really intense kind of pulling instinct and is going out to the end of that 15 or 30-foot line and dragging them forward, then we have some other skills we need to work on before we're
Yeah.
even ready to consider off leash stuff. Some
Yeah.
dogs will find that tension, and when the leash is off, they're like, wait, okay, I'll walk with you. And so we could start kind of teaching, wearing a long line and dragging it around and
Mm-hmm.
engaging with us versus always being out at the end.
Yeah.
Most of the time when we're talking about a 15 to 30-foot leash, like, that's plenty of space for our dogs not needing to be pulling,
Yeah.
for most dogs, I will say.
Yeah.
So then kind of transitioning over to, like, what do we teach the dog to do?
Yeah.
And of course, this is very multifaceted, but my goal, of course, is an auto check in with me every so often. I want the off leash
Mm-hmm.
dog companion that is thinking about checking in with me regularly, even if I haven't cued them. So I start with just really, really reinforcing an auto check in focus
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of different environments. And yes, we add the name cue. Yes, we add a recall cue. But for the most part, the biggest thing that I reinforce is my dog just thinking every so often, hey, I'm going to go back to my human and get a pretty praise, excited engagement, maybe a treat,
Yeah.
maybe a toy thrown. Because ultimately, when we're off leash on the trail, I don't want to have to be calling my dog back to me
Right.
every time they get to that boundary. I want my dog thinking, I got to come back and check in with my person regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. And that's something I agree. Like when I'm working on skills with dogs,
Hmm.
I'm always trying to train them how to make good choices without us constantly having to micromanage
Right,
them. I
right,
don't want to go out with the dog that I'm constantly, watch me, sit, stay,
right,
nice job, let's go, sit, wait,
right,
right? I want them to just kind of pick up on some environmental cues and start to
right.
learn how to make those choices. And
Yep.
we teach them that through reinforcement,
Right,
right? They
right.
do something good, we capture it, yes, nice job,
Mhm.
and pay them for it.
Yeah.
But when we're out in the woods with a ton of distractions around,
Mhm.
that auto check-in can be really tough. So
Yeah.
working in a variety of environments and
Mhm.
also being mindful about those distractions around us,
Yeah.
trying to work in quieter environments when we first start out. And
Yeah.
then as they're doing well, slowly increase that distraction level.
Right. Yes. And I also look for other cues that I can start to work in there, like me stopping. Even just on a regular leash walk, if I'm going somewhere and I just kind of stop and pause, maybe I'll look at a sign or something. I'm going to watch for my dog out of the corner of my eye and see, do
Yeah.
they check in with me? And if they check in, I'm going to praise and reward. I want my dog to just to kind of be aware of when I change myself, when I change something, and to think, oh, wait, if something changes, I should check in and I should,
Yeah.
re-engage without necessarily needing a verbal cue. So just looking for
Yeah.
those opportunities in our daily walks around the neighborhood. And then, as of course, when we get to the trail as well, can be really, really
Mhm.
helpful.
Yeah. So on top of those check-ins, and for everybody watching, go ahead and drop any questions that you have into the comments, and we'll be sure to get to those before we wrap up here. But on top of the natural check-ins and teaching dogs to stick close, we
Hmm.
of course also want to put those behaviors on a verbal cue so
Yes.
that if the dog isn't offering it on their own, they could then
Hmm.
respond to cue and it would
Yes.
be reliable. So do you work on, I assume, cued attention, cued
Mhm.
recall, and
Yeah.
a cued like get close in case you have
Yes.
to leash them or put a hand on them?
Yes, absolutely. All of those things. And I try to split them out into small pieces and then put them together into a chain,
Yeah.
because our recall sequence, when we cue our dog to initiate that sequence, we have a series of tough behaviors there.
Mhm.
First, if our dog's out 20, 30 feet, sniffing something or listening for something, and we say their name, we're asking for an orientation away from distraction and then a move towards us and then a come all the way back towards us without getting distracted along the way,
Yeah.
and then get close enough that we can touch them. So we have that whole series of pieces of behavior. I tend to split into several smaller pieces. So I'm going to work on that attention piece first, just basically kind of supercharging a name cue or supercharging that recall cue where when I say, puppy's name, in my case, it's Jamie. So I'll say, Jamie, treat, Jamie, treat, Jamie, treat, Jamie, treat, 5, 10 times, and then maybe start tossing my treats a little bit further away when I deliver them. So my dog's getting a little bit further away, and then I say, Jamie, and they know treats are going to come right back at me and then back out again. And then I'm going to work on kind of the excited running towards me. And I typically do this with a couple different ways where one, just getting the puppy excited about chasing me. When I'm moving, that provides some excitement. I will also, I work a lot on this with a toy as a reinforcer. So something that kind of adds arousal and excitement for my dog, where I won't necessarily kind of dangle the toy and say, come get it. But if he knows we're playing with a toy, maybe I'll toss a treat out and I'll say his name and he comes running over, and then I present the treat or the toy, and we have a really fun, engaging time. So like there's a lot of high arousal in that kind of rocket back towards me piece. And just lots of repetition of that. Lots of like consistently, when you rock it over to me, I'm going to continue to engage with you in a really, really fun way. And I also think one of the things that I see my clients struggling with here is we often are looking for perfection before we start the reinforcement sequence. And with a recall away from distractions, especially on the trail or off leash, it's not a performance obedience recall in that we want to say one cue and the dog comes and sits, and then we give another cue and they go around. It is more of a relationship communication sequence together. And so my reward sequence starts as soon as the dog starts moving towards me. And if you listen to any of my hiking videos, like if I look at my GoPro footage after a hike, I am like making a fool of myself. As soon as my dog starts turning and running back to me, I am partying, carrying on. My voice gets 3 notches higher. I am praising, and my dog comes rocketing up to me. And then I start paying, with whatever reinforcement we're using. But I'm not looking for that perfect come and sit in front of me recall before I offer any feedback for my dog, especially not when I'm first training it with young puppies or young adolescent dogs.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I see that a ton too. We say their name, we give them their recall word, and then we wait. And the dog comes running back towards them, and the human's not doing anything. The dog's like, oh, what's that? I think I'll sniff that.
Right. That seems more exciting.
And then we've just had a partial recall away from a distraction with no payment. And then we get the undesired behavior of, right? So I agree. I'm big on the, give them feedback immediately, let them know, because that sequence, even of just disengaging from a distraction at a distance, that's hard. Then they're starting motion towards you, away from the distraction. That's even harder, right? And so reinforcing that, praising, being silly, having fun, letting them know that that was what you wanted, and keep doing it, and what a nice job. And then when they make it all the way back to you, even more reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. Now, something else that I notice quite a bit that I work on pretty hard when I'm doing off-leash skills is some form of touch where we are making contact with the dog. Because oftentimes it can be easy for people to ignore the dog when they're doing the right thing on the trail. And then we see a distraction or something happens and, hey, you need to come back to me. I need to put a leash on you. And that can be pretty punishing for a lot of dogs because we just, taken away that freedom, and now they're with us again. And so a lot of the times us reaching for them, us touching them, putting that leash on means fun is over, and that can poison our recall. So I work quite a bit on, I'm going to touch your collar as part of your recall, or your harness, or I'm going to clip the leash on, pay you, unclip it, and you can go again. Like lots of little games to help teach the dog that just because they're coming back and I'm putting my hands on them does not mean that fun time is going to be over.
Right. Yes, I do something similar with Jamie. Going one step further, because he's 8 pounds, I work a lot on a pickup at the end of our recall, so that, mountain lions following down the trail, whatever in that future scenario that I have nightmares about. I have an option here that he's well conditioned to, and that it's not aversive to him. And we work on, positive pickups a lot in other contexts too, but also in this coming out of play or coming out of something exciting, in addition to just kind of grabbing harness or collar. Obviously
Yeah.
not
Yeah. No, I think
something that
that's
you would
great.
practice with a Malamute, but
I don't know. I bet I could do
yeah, I
it.
bet you could.
It's pretty challenging. Pretty challenging. Yeah, we do mostly collar touches for that game.
Yes.
But yeah, no, pickups are good because for those little dogs, you don't know when that is going to be an issue. And oftentimes, and you probably have more experience with this because I know you're like the little dog master now, but I see lots of people picking their dogs up to avoid situations instead of training or managing. And so then even that can be kind of aversive to dogs,
Yeah.
and they'll start to avoid their people anytime their people bend over and pick them up.
Right. Yeah. It's something we work
So
hard on.
yeah, so we're building all of these skills, and obviously it takes a long time for us to get that attention, the recall, teaching dogs how to stay close on their own, how to check in on their own, working on those collar touches or pickups, and then putting it all together when we first start going out takes a lot. It takes a lot of management on our part, a lot of, mental activity. We have to be very, very aware as we're working with our dogs. When you first start going out, obviously we're using a long line for safety because we're still training these skills out in the real world. Do you pick certain parks or certain locations based on distraction level when you're first going out?
I do. I have lovely trails pretty close to me that I love that I, with a young puppy, would never do on a Saturday morning. So doing things, like going on a weekday or a weekday evening, or going at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning instead of 10 a.m. It definitely helps me kind of set criteria up for success there. I'm also, I think we mentioned this already, kind of picking spaces where I can see things coming, where I know there's going to be spots to hop off the trail if I need to, because that's the other piece that I am starting to work on with, my young dogs, is this expectation when other people and other dogs are coming down the trail towards us. It's not automatically a greet and playtime. We default to stepping off to the side and yielding the trail, and then maybe we can say hi, once we've kind of determined whether that's something that would be mutually enjoyed by the other people as well. And so I start teaching that even on a 6-foot leash or a long line, this kind of expectation that, oh, we see someone coming down and we're going to hop off, 10 feet and sit over here on this rock and let the other people pass. And so I'm thinking about like, okay, cliffs or other environmental factors that would limit that. I am going to be less likely to choose those trails when I anticipate I'm going to meet a bunch of people. And yeah, those are some of my considerations. Some of my earliest hikes with Jamie were, an hour to 2 hours drive away from where I live, where I was pretty confident we weren't going to see anybody. And then we just got to go and practice being off leash in an environment where I wasn't worried about him, being concerned or overwhelmed or unable to practice good behaviors with those other people. And I know that's not an option for everyone to dedicate that amount of time or even have those areas nearby, accessible. In my area, it's a blessing for sure.
Yeah, we do the same. We wake up if we're going on a weekend, we wake up really early,
a
couple hours before sunrise so that we can get to the trail just before sunrise, because it sets your dog up for success better. Fewer distractions, fewer complications, a little less stressful for everybody, and then you can really just go out and enjoy your time. So we've got our long line. We're working on, starting to put all of these different skills into practice on the trail after doing some structured, at home or at the park training. A big question that comes up, that has actually come up in the chat, is what do we do if our dog doesn't do the skill? Right? So we say their name or we ask them to come when called and they don't, because that distraction's really exciting, right? They're invested in something else. So what's our game?
So if my dog is on a long line and I cue name or cue recall cue and they don't respond, my first line of defense is going to be to kind of slow down and stop myself if I'm not already going, if I'm not already stopped. And I'm going to just let them reach the end of that line, but not go any further. So that's going to be kind of the boundary of you heard me call, and you didn't respond, and like you don't get to keep going forward or towards whatever it is. So I first start by kind of slowing them down and stopping. And it's important, kind of to remind of what we said before, is I'm not going to add tension or try to pull them back.
Mhm.
I'm just going to stop. And then my second strategy, once I've reached a kind of static position, is I'm then going to work to go closer to my dog. So going
Mhm.
closer might look like going hand over fist and retracting the line in my hand. So I'm not going to just kind of start walking towards my dog and let the line drop between us. And then, of course, the dog might be, another 6 feet out ahead. We're going to instead
Yeah.
work on retracting the line as I move closer.
Mhm.
And I then also tend to kind of swing into my dog's peripheral a little bit. So if my dog is oriented this way and I'm coming up behind them, instead of coming straight up behind, I kind of move myself so I'm in the peripheral. This makes that turn back to me less of a 180 degrees and more of a, maybe 75 or 90-degree turn,
Mhm.
depending on how close I need to get in order to get into my dog's vision. And then
Yeah.
as soon as they turn and give a little bit of acknowledgement, I'm going to, start my party, run back away, get them moving with me if they can, and then be ready to reward them for moving with. I try really hard not to keep repeating my recall cue unless I've changed something else in the environment. So
Mhm.
gone, and covered half the distance to them, or gotten into their peripheral and paused for a second, and then maybe then I will repeat that recall cue, but not just kind of throwing it out there into the
Yeah.
void, if I can help it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's hard because we're like, we called them, they're not responding. Maybe they can't
Right.
hear me. Maybe I need to
Right.
sound more exciting, and so oftentimes we'll then get stuck with repeating sounds and
Yeah.
noises, and the dog is just completely tuning us out,
Yeah.
and we're desensitizing them to all of our attention grabbers and
Right.
noises. It
Right.
can be tempting to, use them, but we
Yep.
have to make those decisions sometimes. And then I think the other thing that people have a hard time with is reinforcing the dog with as much excitement after they do it,
Right.
because they didn't do it the first time, right?
Right.
I asked you to do the thing and you didn't, and then
Yep.
I had to do all the work, and now I pay you. And that can be
Right.
really hard for people.
Yep.
But I think it's important to know that your dog didn't look at it like that.
Right.
Your dog still did the thing.
Right.
And then,
And
I don't, sorry.
especially at first, when we're really trying to build in that recall behavior history and that reinforcement history for that, I pay every time. When I
Yeah.
have that kind of, veteran off-leash dog that has a lot of experience coming away from different types of distractions, and if I call, my last dog Rue, if I called him away from a smell on the ground and he didn't come, and I kind of had to go closer and manage and get his attention, and finally he looked up and was like, "Oh, hey, I guess I'll come," I would say, "Good boy, thanks for coming." But I wouldn't be dishing out the hot dogs like I
Right.
would with a young puppy, where I kind of have raised the criteria a bit. This is okay, now you need to come on the first time I call. And if you don't, I'm not going to be mad
Yeah.
about and fuss at you, because I don't want to punish that, attention that he did give
Yeah.
to me, but I'm also not going to pay as generously.
Yeah.
But that's only after my dog has demonstrated a really strong proficiency of
Mhm.
choosing those behaviors. And then it's the occasional time that that they say, I'm just going to choose to do this, that I say, okay, well, I'm going to reward you with praise, but not that high value treat that you were
Yeah.
thinking you were going to get. If
Yeah,
that
and I
makes
like
sense.
that you made that distinction too between when we're working on a young dog and when we have a dog that's a little more experienced, because
Yeah.
I'm going to take that feedback a little bit differently as well.
Yeah.
If I'm working with a young dog that has a lot less experience, that we're just starting
Mhm.
out and we're really working on building that reliability to
Right.
that cue, I'm going to say, okay, the distraction was this, the
Yep.
distance away from me was this, and you
Hmm.
couldn't do it.
Right.
So I might get creative and go back to the drawing board and figure out how I could recreate a similar setup where it
Yep.
was just a little bit easier, so
Yep.
that the dog could get more history of reinforcement under their belt, get more success,
Yep.
right? As we build back up to that more challenging scenario.
Right. Yes. 100%.
So we've got some questions here. I'm going to go ahead and pop those up. And if anyone is
Okay.
tuning along and wants to drop your own question in, feel free to. So we have a question here from Sneha. She says, is mine pulling okay instead of actually tugging? So she is a Siberian Husky, just so that you are aware. So we're a little bit more independent, and we do dog powered sports. So he's been reinforced for pulling as well as loose leash. But instead of actual tugging, so you can get closer to them and get their attention before releasing them.
So if my understanding of what you mean by mind pulling is the kind of like moving yourself closer up along the leash as you pull it back into your hand. So we're kind of not giving tension, but we're maintaining that tension as we get closer. Is that kind
That's
of,
how I
would you
interpret
share
it
that
as well.
definition? And that would be exactly what I would do in that situation is, if our dogs are not coming back when we've called them, instead of tugging, I would go closer and not release that tension like we talked about, so that the dog's not off again, further down the distraction rabbit hole, but rather me going closer and them being able to get into their peripheral or call them back a little bit better.
Yeah. And that skill in and of itself does take a little bit of finesse. It takes a little bit of practice, because it's, you have to have just enough pressure that the dog has put there themselves so that they don't feel the release of tension and start moving. But you have to be careful that you're not adding additional tension to the dog, so that, you're not pulling them backwards or adding additional tugs onto that line.
Yeah. Good question.
How do you train with distractions such as deer when you never know when you'll encounter them?
Yes. So I do a lot of different aspects coming into this. One is I am training my dog in general, this kind of like look but don't touch, I call it, framework, where we practice this with a lot of different distractions, wildlife included, especially going to places where there might be squirrels or things that where we can predict that there's going to be something pretty exciting. And but I mean by look but don't touch is I just reinforce my dog for like, oh, something new appears in the environment and they get rewarded back at me. We do that with, people rolling out trash bins, other dogs suddenly appearing, squirrels running across their path, cats, whatever we encounter. I am just generally teaching my dog that when something appears in the environment, it's a good chance that I'm going to want to pay them for just watching that thing. And then, we start to add in different aspects, like when we do encounter deer. I really want to be kind of aware of the environment and aware like of the time of day. Is this a time of day when we may run into deer on the trail, or is this an area where I've seen deer before? And so in those cases, when we're entering those environments, I'm going to be more aware of what's going on, or more aware of trying to set my dog up for success. So maybe if it's a place, and I have a place in my head where I walk, frequently, and I know like on one side of the trail, there's often a lot of deer there in the morning. So as I'm coming around the loop, when I get to that spot, I'm going to be really mindful about maybe we'll see deer right now, and be ready to reward. Even if we don't, I can still reward the dog for checking in and being able to focus on me in an area where I know that there are deer living in that area. So even if we don't see them, my dog is smelling them. My dog is aware of their presence. And so I can still be training focus even in those environments where they don't kind of pop up and surprise us. So those are kind of my kind of baseline strategies. I tell people you're never going to have a deer in your pocket to reward your dog with, but you're going to have hundreds of repetitions of easier examples of check-ins, where our dogs get paid for voluntarily or cued coming back to us and getting reinforced for that. And so building up that reinforcement of those behaviors pay off really well. Really helps us build behaviors that are resilient for those surprising things that we encounter.
Yeah. And that's so important that we are working on these behaviors with a variety of distractions in our training plan, because we don't have a pet deer that we can put out in the yard and have it be stationary and work on lots of repetitions, but we can do it with all the other things you mentioned: trash cans, other dogs, squirrels, birds, leaves blowing. And so your dog is figuring out that every time they see something new or see something exciting, it pays to check back in, whether it's voluntary or we're cueing it. And that starts to become a pattern for them then.
Yeah.
And, again, deer are going to be kind of that big distraction. Wildlife in general are that big distraction. But
Yeah.
I mean, we can even be strategic. And if we know that there's, a petting zoo or some neighbors down the street that have some wildlife, we can do some
Yeah.
structured setups where we go and the animals are off in the distance in,
Yep.
a fenced area, and we could work on attention so that they're getting lots of different experiences under their belt. And more importantly, those experiences are successful. The dog
Right.
is getting reinforcement for those check-ins and that attention to us.
Yeah. I think the other important thing that helps us be successful with those types of encounters is being hyper aware of our dog's behavior and changes in our
Yeah.
dog's behavior that might indicate that there are things present in the environment that we might be ready to train for. With
Yeah.
my last dog, Rue, we I learned very quickly when we moved into an area where our hikes encompass the risk of encountering moose. We didn't train, we didn't live around moose for the first 6 years of his life, but then we moved into an area where we were going to encounter moose on the trails. And so I noticed the first two moose encounters we had, I thought back like, oh, his behavior changed pretty significantly right before we rounded the corner and there's a moose. And
Yeah.
I didn't really know why or what was up in those cases. His nose went to the ground. He, kind of started zigzagging in ways that wasn't normal for him. So I just kind of default put him back on leash. And then we came around the corner and there was a moose. And so
Yeah.
then after I noticed that pattern for all of our hikes and backpacking trips after that, when I saw that change of behavior, you better believe he was right on leash right away, or I
Yeah.
was ready to keep him close to me or whatever it is. And it wasn't, it wasn't foolproof. We did have an encounter with a moose where neither of us knew that it was coming, and I was able to successfully call him away from furthering that encounter
Yeah.
because we had been intentional about managing the situations when we could be proactive.
Yeah.
We had that reinforcement in the bank that when that moose kind of surprised both of us, and I said, Rue, get over here right now. He came over
Yeah.
and was able to do that.
Yeah, I think that observation in the environment is so important in structured training sessions and when you're heading out to go on hikes with them, because you never know when something's going to happen. But our dogs are really smart, and so we can use our observation skills to observe their change of behavior, right? To watch them and allow them to kind of help us out when there might be something in the vicinity.
Yeah.
So we've got a question here from Brooke. She has a Shiba, which is stereotypically not an off-leash dog. They've got a awesome recall in an enclosed area on a fence and on a long line. And they're wondering what their next steps are and if there are some breeds of dogs that can never be off-leash.
So next steps, I would say for a dog that has an awesome kind of 15-foot long line recall is I would probably expand that to a 30-foot long line
Mhm.
and practice in some of those same environments. And when we're getting, and what I would specifically be looking for there is, can we get that recall before our dog hits the end of the line? So making sure that our recall cues are coming when the line is still dragging on the ground or still slack behind the dog. And can the dog turn around without needing to feel that tension on the leash first that tells them they've reached the end of the available space,
Yeah.
and practicing that quite a bit. Then my next step transitioning off of that 30-foot line is actually still a 30-foot line, but I start to kind of let the dog drag the end of it, assuming that we're in a space that's safe for that. We're not going to be clotheslining or tangling up, mountain bikers or other people and dogs that we encounter. But I actually then just start kind of letting the dog wander around with that 30-foot line. And then I continue to back up the length of line to then back to our 15-foot with the dog dragging it, and then maybe to a 6-foot with the dog dragging it. And that drag line is just so that if our dog were to start to make a mistake, maybe we see a distraction and they start running towards it, and we call them back and they don't start whipping back around, we could reach the end of that line very quickly and interrupt that, and help them move back to us without
Mhm.
needing them to be able to run off and get reinforced with that. And then
Yeah.
as far as kind of, can any dog, are there any breeds of dog that can never be off leash? I don't like to make breed generalizations because I think that dogs can be, certainly have genetics that kind of indicate behavior patterns or defaults. but there's always exceptions to that rule. And I think with, consistent training, with good management setups, and, kind of always being mindful about what your dog's limitations might be, I think that, a lot of dogs can be successful. And I wouldn't rule out a dog just on the basis of what breed they are.
Yeah, I'm big on not labeling breeds. I think that in general, it can be very damaging for us because oftentimes those labels tend to restrict our ability to truly just look at the behavior of the dog.
Yeah.
And then we make assumptions that they can't do something because of X, Y, and Z. And I think it actually just impedes our ability to make progress with them. So, Brooke, I have one of those stereotypical dogs that can't be off leash as well. It just takes time and consistency. And like we were talking about earlier, there are certain breed traits that might make certain dogs easier to train to do certain things. But at the end of the day, all behavior can be modified. Right. So there is hope.
Yes.
If you have those good training plans in place and keep progressing those skills, you could get there.
And I think that it's also important, just to give a little perspective, that building these behavior patterns takes time and intentionality and consistent payment. For perspective, with my Aussie Roo, part of a lot of this I attribute to kind of my fear and my hesitancy and just figuring it out. But I wouldn't say we didn't really start like off leash hiking and me really trusting him in environments to like run and come back until he was about 4 years old. We were doing off leash prep skills that whole time, and we were doing off leash like on our own property. I lived on 4 acres at that time, and so we were able to do off leash stuff in that context safely. But as far as like going to a trail and trusting him to be completely off leash, like that took time with a breed that has kind of those kind of auto check-in behaviors that we've talked about being really helpful. And I think that timeline is not prescriptive for anyone. I could probably have done it in a different way, if I had been more confident. And with Jamie, now I am making more intentional investments in this behavior so that we can accelerate that. But that's just a kind of a note of confidence that says if it's not happening now at 2 years old, that doesn't mean your dog is not going to get there.
Yeah, I love that. So we've got a great question here from Laura. 2 dogs. When we've got 2 dogs, we tend to have more trouble than when we have 1.
Yep.
So how do we start working on that?
My suggestion would be, continuing to invest in those skills with them separately as well is important. So making sure that they get individual time to really work on those skills. And then when we start to bring them together, if it gets if their behavior together, they're maybe a lot more confident together, willing to race off through the woods together and have a great time. I start by just keeping one on a long line. If 2 dogs on a long line is too difficult to manage, because especially if you're just one person. I've definitely hiked with people where multiple people had dogs on long lines and it's manageable. But if you're one person holding 2 long lines, definitely gets a little bit much more complicated. So I would have one dog on a long line and maybe have the other one just dragging a 6-foot leash or something. And that can often encourage both of them to stay closer. And then we're looking for rewarding, not just good check-ins, but also good kind of pause and be calm for a moment skills too, where we can have some prolonged like break times where dogs can just kind of sit and have a quiet, peaceful moment, get rewarded, and then keep going to kind of cut down on that kind of frenzied, we're whipping each other up into an excited, let's race around in the woods type of mental state.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that would be my suggestions that I would give to clients. What are your additional thoughts, Chelsea?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that when we bring 2 dogs into the mix, no matter what activity we are doing, energy levels rise. They are the same species. And if they live in your house together, they're probably buddies. So, that energy level increases even more, which is a huge distraction. And it makes it hard for them to, engage with us. And it makes it easier for them to romp around the woods together and go chase the squirrels and the bunnies, So really making sure you're spending time with each individual dog separately, because that will give you a good idea as to how strong all those behaviors are with that dog. You might realize that one of your dogs has a really solid recall, really solid attention, but the other one is maybe not quite as strong. So working on them solo to kind of identify where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. And then whenever we're taking both of them out together, you know, finding the easiest environment for them to be successful, you know, really trying to pick quieter places, places with really good visibility so that we can be proactive about interrupting and kind of getting them back to us quicker. And I love your suggestions about taking pauses, because I think that that's hard for dogs, period. The more dogs that are around, the harder it is. So taking that moment to just let them take a deep breath, let that arousal level drop a little bit, which is going to make that attention and connection with us a lot easier.
Yeah.
Let's see here. All right, so we've got a long question here. I want to try to shorten it. So if I am interpreting this correctly, we're trying to figure out how to set up a real world test without putting the dog in a position where they are failing, because then they would be getting reinforcement from their environment. Trying to figure out what that looks like, what the environment needs to be set up for, and kind of what they would be observing or looking at to identify, is this successful? Am I on the right track? Or is this challenging?
One of the ways that I have practiced this with my own dog, kind of gauging, right now I'm kind of at this stage where I'm gauging, like, okay, in what scenarios can we go back to going off leash, when there might be distractions around, you know, kind of after that one inadvertent failure, that we encountered a few months back. And so, you know, we stepped back, and now I'm kind of at the stage where I'm testing out some of these things. So I think I've been in a similar place than what Anna is questioning here, like trying to determine, like, what are my dog's skills, and where do we go from here. So one of the things I've been doing is I've been holding my, let me get my finger in front of the camera here, my long line, which is not, this is not normal long line handling skills recommendations, but as I've been kind of determining, like, can I get away from my long line, I've been holding my hand on my long line like this as I'm hiking and walking, and doing my very best to kind of move my dog and cue my dog to move around without any leash management whatsoever. So the long line is there as backup, but if I wanted to move my dog one way, I need to be able to verbally cue them to move with me or move myself that way. So that's one of my kind of tests. The other piece is I work in a field often, near my house, and that's one of the places we develop a lot of our off leash skills outside of the trail environment, where we have a lot more space and we kind of can see what we're working with. And there's a lot of exciting things in that field. My dog is excited by trash and random debris, but your dog might not be that interested. You could set up other things, like a person standing there, or a dog, and a person, at different points around the field, planted series of your dog's favorite toys, whatever it is, and then kind of start moving towards those exciting things. And, you know, with your leash either held lightly or not at all, you know, practice calling your dog away from those things that you plant, and see, can your dog successfully come back when you know ahead of time this is where that's going to be.
Yeah.
So, and I'm looking for my dog to whip and turn their head back to me before they feel any tension on the leash. That's my objective. Is so I'm calling at the certain point that maybe my dog starts taking off running towards that exciting thing. I want to be able to say, Jamie, come, and see him whip around and move back towards me without needing that leash tension.
Yeah.
And so that also, we haven't really talked about, like, practicing this at your dog's different speeds of movement is also important, too. And those are levels of difficulty that I layer in. So that's what I've been working on with Jamie. I don't know
I
if
love
that
that.
answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. If I had that question, I mean, how I interpreted it anyways, I think that was brilliant, because I love doing training setups where I know what's going to happen, so I can be prepared. I know ahead of time what I'm looking for and what cues I'm going to give, but the dog doesn't necessarily know it's a setup.
Right.
So you drive somewhere new, they think they're just going on a normal hike.
Yep.
I set up those little tests for them, which I'm not like making them crazy hard. They'd be realistic as to what we've accomplished in structured training. And then I say, can you do it here?
Yep.
what does it look like, right? Am
Mm-hmm.
I getting that same wicked fast response when the
Yeah.
dog knows they're in a structured session? Or
Yeah.
am I starting to see a little bit of hesitancy, more interest in the environment than me? And that would be good information. But I
Yeah.
love doing setups like that where I can prepare mentally, I know what I'm doing, and the
Yeah.
dog is kind of like not doesn't have their head in the game at the same
Mm-hmm.
level, because it really gives
Right.
us the ability to observe that response and see where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to do one more question here before we wrap up. It's a good one that I think will apply to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we're in the middle of a city, and the dog park has an off-leash section, which they have a lot of those around where we are here in Atlanta. And in those parks, there's a ton of other people. There's dogs. My dog's recall's pretty good, but once in a while he senses something and runs off. The behavior is self-rewarding because he gets to go greet other people and go, do whatever he
Yeah.
wants. So what do I do with what I have?
Yes. So one of my favorite ways to use dog parks to practice is actually to have my dog on that long line just outside of the dog park, and perhaps do kind of some walks around and let my dog go up and sniff and engage, assuming there are friendly dogs that are coming up to the fence, like not. But then practice calling them away from those situations when there isn't the opportunity to like get tangled up in other dogs. I typically
Right.
don't recommend using a long line in a dog park or really any sort of leash tether, just because that can cause conflict with dog play, and really isn't something that I think sets anyone up for success to do that in a dog park where there's going to be other dogs coming up to play. I would practice in other situations where I'm at, maybe a distance at the soccer field across the street or whatever. I don't have this particular setup in my head, but finding a ways to modify the situation in such a way that I can start working on that good behavior that I want to see at a distance where my dog can be successful. And then we move closer as ready. The other thing I often recommend for dog park use is going at those times when maybe there's only going to be 2 or 3 people playing, and not when there's going to be 30 dogs playing. So going at 7 a.m. in the morning and saying like, okay, we're going to work on the difficulty of 2 or 3 people playing with their dogs, and then we're going to add in to 5 or 6 people, and that sort of thing. I also will think about like, okay, how can we recreate this situation when I have more control over it? How can I, recruit a neighbor's backyard that maybe my dog doesn't get to play in very often, and practice in that environment where there's a lot of distractions, and we have perhaps a different ability to manage the situation with a fence and something that, but it's still an environment that's new for my dog, and we can still practice on kind of calling them away and re-engaging them with us there. With that kind of um, people picnicking and other types of distractions, this is where that look but don't touch thing comes into play a lot, where I spend a lot of time with my dogs just kind of in a stationary position adjacent to people doing different things with different food, different noises, different, kids in strollers, dogs under the picnic table, whatever it is. Like I spend a time at the distance just working on my dog, saying like, I chill there and watch those people. And those people are not relevant to me. Even if they might toss food towards me, I get rewarded more from my person. And, if there are a lot of rewards coming from the environment, we need to set it up so that as much as we can, and I know there are environmental limitations with every training situation whatsoever. Um, but setting it up so like, okay, if the people are throwing hot dogs, I'm offering steak, at least temporarily, or I'm offering hot dogs too, and all of that.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And it's hard. We see our dogs, potentially failing in a certain environment, and it can be hard to figure out, because I feel like oftentimes owners will do, what can I do in this moment right here? And
Right.
there's very little that, I mean, there are things we can do. And your, example with Jamie at the beginning was a great one for that. How do we respond to the moment? But we always need to take that information and then take our skills out of that environment. back to
Mm-hmm.
the drawing board. And so I
Right.
always look at that environment or whatever was around us when the dog is having trouble,
Yeah.
right? So maybe there's a creek around, maybe there
Mm-hmm.
are other people, maybe there's also other dogs, maybe people have food on them,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's trash cans, right?
Yep.
I'm just looking at everything in that environment. And then I'm doing additional setups
Yep.
in different environments that have those components
Mm-hmm.
so that I'm breaking that big picture down into really little pieces
Yep.
where I can practice each one of those components
Right.
separately. And then
Yep.
we start layering it back in. And it might mean that temporarily we don't go to that dog park, or like
Yep.
you said, we go when it's going to be really quiet so that
Mm-hmm.
the dog isn't rehearsing the undesired behavior,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because each time they
Yeah.
do, it makes it harder for us to get the right behavior from them.
Right.
So it's all about environmental setup to the best of our ability,
Mm-hmm.
and then taking those challenges, splitting them into little pieces that are manageable, that we can isolate, and trying to recreate that in other ways where the dog's
Mm-hmm.
going, oh, okay, so even though there's other dogs, I can
Right.
recall.
Right.
Even though there's the scent of food over there, I can recall.
Right.
And getting that history of reinforcement back into that picture.
Yeah. With Jamie, when he had his kind of, adolescent, I'm going to go make friends moment, not
Yeah.
only did we go back on our management, but we started adding in, I called up 3 dog friends and was like, okay, I need someone to meet me at the park. I'll be there this day. Who wants to come? Well, let's
Yeah.
practice at either ends of the field. And we set up some intentional practice sessions and said, nope, there's another dog over there. You're still with me. Remember this, there's another dog over there. You're still with me. And
Yeah.
we worked that back into our training plan. And then we went back to practicing in those real life environments.
Yeah.
But, we're willing to take kind of a step back and say, okay, that was obviously a too difficult of a situation for me to trust that he could make a good decision there. So let's train it. And then we'll go back to that real life environment.
Yeah.
And I think that there's this balance that often I think gets skewed one way or the other, where people either overmanage and undertrain, or they,
Mhm.
undermanage and undertrain,
Yeah.
and we really want to kind of have this balance in the middle where we're giving our dogs the opportunities to be successful, but understanding that they don't need to fail in
Yeah.
order for us to be successful. They
Yeah.
don't need to be rehearsing. And in fact, it's much better if they're not rehearsing so many
Yes.
instances of that unwanted behavior. I do have this kind of one strike policy when I'm hiking off leash with my dog, where if I recall my dog and they don't come, they're back on leash immediately next time I
Yeah.
catch them. Like, it's just not even let's give them another chance or anything like that. It's
Yeah.
like a one strike thing. And it sounds kind of harsh to say, but it is really kind of just something that I have to stick to, and I have to say, nope, if you can't come back when I call you, then we're going back to basics, at least
Yeah.
for the next 30 minutes, and then we'll try again.
Yeah.
And because I don't want those failures to be
Mhm.
part of that discussion.
Yeah. I think that's huge. And it takes time. I think that's
Mhm.
something else that, like, everybody who's listening, everyone who catches up afterwards, even as a professional trainer, this takes years.
Mhm.
Anyone telling you they can do it in a month, stay away. Like, these foundations really do take time to build.
Mhm.
So keep working on them. But the goal with all of it is that we're continuing to advance the skills slowly.
Mhm.
Don't get stuck doing the same thing. And if you feel like you're getting stuck and you're not making progress, it's a really good time to reach out to a certified professional trainer who uses positive reinforcement, who has experience working off leash with
Mhm.
dogs, because it's an art. It takes some time to develop, and working on it, it's going to take you some time, and you might need a little help, and that's totally okay.
Mhm.
So any last minute tips or kind of words of wisdom from you, Amber, about off leash
I
training for
think
dogs?
one of the things that I had to learn through my work with my dog was the ability to kind of relax myself
Mhm.
and take a deep breath and be willing to trust my training. And that takes some time. We talk about our dogs building up a reinforcement history with off leash work. We also need to build up our reinforcement history of it going well,
Yeah.
and it paying off. And that requires just some time and intentionality here. And I start by just practicing taking a deep breath when my
Mhm.
dog is running and enjoying the romp around. I take a deep breath, I breathe, practice, and then I recall and praise a lot, and work on
Mhm.
just kind of emphasizing to myself, like, this is good, this is safe. Because I
Yeah,
think if we relax about it, our dogs are more likely to want to engage with us more. If we're
yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
stressed and like, no, stay close, come here, come over here, no, come on. I call that pestering our dogs. If we're doing
Yeah,
that, that's more likely to make our dogs kind of want to check out.
yeah.
So we have to find that balance.
Yep, I think that's really important. Really important. Lots of good info here. For some of the basics that Amber was talking about building attention and doing, high excitement chase recall, we do have some video tutorials on those. So I'll be sure to update our description and drop those in for you guys so that you can kind of get some tutorials and watch a little bit about how the process works. And of course, Amber, if you have anything that you want to share as well, send that to me and I'll put
Okay.
that in here.
Will
And
do.
then I'll also add in Amber's social media so that you guys can get connected and follow along with her and her company over Summit Dog Training. They've got some great stuff for you guys as well to help you reach your goals with your dogs.
Awesome.
Amber, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This has been fun.